Hi, everyone. I'm so grateful that I have Barb Patterson here to have a conversation with me today. And Barb is a good friend, but she's also been an incredible mentor to me as well. And we're also in a mastermind together. And we run some programs together like the Engage Space and our Solopreneur Mastermind. And Barb has an amazing business summit that's coming up in Portland in October that I know you're really excited about, and I'm excited to go. And I'm sure you'll share more about that as part of this conversation. And Barb works with entrepreneurs, leaders. She mentors other coaches and really helping people take things to the next level from a place of deep presence, and it not being from pushing harder, working more, but really from having a deepening of the understanding and a deepening of their own grounding, which absolutely creates incredible things in the world. And I love, Barb, how you really put those two together and help people, myself included, put the dots together as to how the understanding and a grounding in the understanding actually really creates real world results. And you have a podcast. You've just launched your
Yeah.
podcast
Oh,
as
yeah.
well. So there's so many exciting things going on.
Great. Thank you.
So, and on top of all of that, with your busy schedule, you're also one of the live webinar teachers in the Soul Centered series. And I'm really grateful that you're participating there as well. So thank you for all of that and for having this conversation today.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you for inviting me seriously. And I have loved your intention and your desire and kind of your purpose behind this program since the moment you first mentioned it. So it's really fun and inspiring to be on the sidelines and to be included in what you're pulling together, Rohini.
Oh, thank you, Barb. And I appreciate all of the support along the way. And so today, what I'd love for you to share with everyone that's going to be watching is sort of what your journey has been in terms of the before and the after with the understanding, how you came across it, and what the impact has been on your life, because I know it's been profound, and you have such an amazing way of sharing what that personal impact has been, and also supporting others with having that same kind of experience for themselves. So whatever you're open to sharing, I'll let you just jump in and we'll go from there.
Okay, thanks. You know what comes to mind is this memory I had. I want to say it was 2013, but I might have that wrong. But I remember I was driving. I had landed in Minneapolis, which is a city I used to live in and very familiar with and love. And I was driving from the airport in the rental towards what was going to be a three principal global community conference. And I had been asked to speak. And so in that drive, I was sort of hit by all the memories of living in Minneapolis and the friends I have there, the career that I had there, and a job I really loved that really nurtured me, and I got to nurture back. It was just this amazing job. And it's the job that took me to Paris. So I was just kind of in this moment of time in a place of reflection. And I had flown in from La Conner, Washington, which is a city I had never heard of, a year and a half prior. I had never heard of it. And it was just really interesting to me because in that moment I thought, wow, because a man named Sydney Banks had a spiritual experience, an epiphany, a realization at the time, 35 plus years ago, because he had seen something so profound and had decided to share it and had the courage. I don't even know if it required courage on his part, but to keep at it. And because he shared it and because of his mission and desire and those teachers that learned from him, without them, I wouldn't have learned it because unfortunately Sydney Banks died before, I learned about the principles. But because of those first generation teachers, many who are on this program, the trajectory of my life, the work I was doing, my community, my colleagues, my internal space, everything was different. Everything. And it was so amazing. And in that moment, I was filled with so much gratitude to Sydney Banks, but also to those first generation teachers, because if they hadn't decided to keep sharing what they'd seen, to carry the torch, I don't know if they'd call it that, but I wouldn't be where I am today. And I still feel that way very much 6 years later, or 5 or 6 years later. How grateful I am for this understanding and for the teachers that have been my guide and my mentor. And I think the biggest difference, and I know a lot of people will relate to this because I think I'm kind of like everyone else. I was going to say ordinary, but I mean ordinary in the best sense of the word, that I had like life compartmentalized before. I had my psychology as something that, I had to work on, and things, and healing my past and getting a better attitude, and all this kind of stuff. I had my personality, which had pros and cons and things I had to watch out for, things I had to deal with. I had my behavior, and sometimes that was not as good as and disciplined as I wanted it to be. And then then there was work, and then there was life, and then there was my friends and my family, and then there was my aspirations and places that I just couldn't seem to get where I wanted them to get. And so those were always the most confusing to me. And, I would give it everything I had to kind of make changes to try and transform and change myself in those areas, and constantly just felt like up against a brick wall. And because this is, my career has been professional, personal, organizational development. This passion of how do you change? Where does real change come from? How do people work? How are we wired? What makes us who we are has always been, I mean, since I was little, something I've been curious about. So this was not something that I had not considered. I had a lot of ideas about all of this. And if you're not getting the sense already, you should, that, there was a lot on my mind about what was required to be a good person, to have a good life. And I also was curious about kind of the spiritual nature of things, and I believed we were a part of something bigger, but I had no real personal relationship to that. I mean, of course, I had some of my family upbringing, religious background, but we weren't uber kind of religious. And I had a lot of woo-woo phenomenon, spiritual kind of cool things that I thought were interesting and fun, but nothing that like went deep, nothing that really, not an internal kind of knowing of it. And the reason I say that is because I think one of the most profound things that has happened for me as I've stayed a student of this, and as I continue, is all those things I mentioned before, all those ways I compartmentalized who I was, my strengths, my weaknesses, my personality, my behavior, my spirituality, all of that in a way just collapsed into one. And it was no longer, keep a spreadsheet of how I'm doing, so I could check the boxes and, adjust where needed. All of a sudden, in a really beautiful way, this understanding collapsed all of that, took so much away and off my mind. And I began to naturally fall into this seeing it all as a integrated. So for example, when I began to understand the role that thought plays, and the fluid nature of thought, and how we feel thought, I naturally began to have a different relationship to my thinking. And it's a journey. And as you know, this is forever a student. But when I began to understand that, I naturally started to have more internal spaciousness. And in that, I was feeling something different inside of me. I was starting to tap into a level, a quality of a richness, being touched by life, experiencing something more personal, like experiential to Barb, about that innate nature and what that is. And I remember when I would hear, the teachers talk about we have innate well-being, that rang really true for me. Like at our core, it rang really true to me that we are perfect and whole. But in my intellect, and when I looked at my behavior, that didn't compute. I'd be like, it would be better if, I had a lot of those on my spreadsheet. And but what was interesting was that voice, that kind of inner knowing, that nudge kept getting louder, like, well, if we're perfect and whole at our core, at that our essence, at that innate nature, whatever that is, then how can the pursuit of fixing myself make sense? Like all of a sudden, those two things didn't quite sit together in the same way. And then that began a journey of me starting to feel like, oh, that well-being isn't about behavior. That points to, a way that just came through for me that just makes sense, is it's this infinite well of being that we all have. And that the more I considered and got curious about that, that's what began for me to see real evidence of where transformation comes, where change comes, how potential is alive and resides in the moment, and anything's up for grabs. I mean, it wasn't really till I had my own personal journey, curiosity, knowing, learning curve around that everything began to change. And that's what I mean when I say then it became kind of one thing versus all these other things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. And it's so powerful to listen to you share how you went from being someone looking on the outside with a very good strategy, or lots of very good strategies of how to fix yourself and improve yourself and get to being the person that you want to be. And the effort, just listening to that, the effort for that. And then to see something that has you really recognize the truth that, oh, all of that out there is a result of where I'm coming from inside. What happens when I look in that direction instead? So I'd love to hear anything more you'd like to say about that shift for you in terms of looking to source, looking to your potential. Like, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. Well, the first thing, like I said, that began to just not quite make sense like it used to. Like I wanted to get behind it like I used to, but I just couldn't, was that idea of every time I would have a thought like, well, life would be better if I could get, exercise more consistently. I could lose a bunch of weight. If my business was doing better, like I had all these but every time I would catch myself leaning into that thinking, that other thing in me would go, wait a minute, like that's building a life or a strategy from an illusion. Like I began to see like an insecure thought before was a good reason to get a strategy. You know what I mean? Like the more reactive, that's when you needed a strategy. And then all of a sudden I started to see like, oh no, like that's the worst time to do a strategy. I'd get nervous or anxious about my business, and then the to-do list would come out. And, you started to see like activity is not the same thing as sort of moving through life connected to that deeper GPS, that kind of knowing and letting that be your guide for ideas and activity. You hear a lot of people say this, but like me too, this was really true. I would have these thoughts like, I, I might just be lazy, or, maybe I don't have it in me. And, this fear that all I'd want to do is watch Netflix and, eat chocolate all day long. Like those were real things. I would have that kind of thinking. But in the midst of that, because of what I was seeing more and more about thought and the illusory nature of it and the habitual nature of some of our own thinking. And, as I saw that more, that deeper knowing, that wisdom, that innate well of being would kind of rise up and say, you're fine. Like you're doing okay. And so I had to kind of learn and, how to discern inside my own self, that feeling. And so, I think it was George at one point, George Pransky, who I know is going to be one of the teachers, who said to me, Barb, there's no correlation between the amount of mental activity and the quality of your results. And I was like, what? Can you speak English, please? could you say that again? And what he was pointing to was, I was at it. I was on hyper vigilance in my mind, lots of mental activity, thinking about my business, thinking about my clients, thinking about how to grow, thinking about how to market, thinking about what I needed to change, and he was pointing me to, and what he would say is, what you'll discover is there is a relationship between your internal spaciousness and higher quality ideas. And that's been true for me, seeing that more and more. Now, of course, I still get sped up. Of course, I still get urgent and, all of that, but I lean into it a lot less. Like I said before, I can't quite get behind it like I used to, but those are examples. Like I remember one time sitting at my desk and getting worried about my business and clients and being able to support myself. And I started to feel myself getting revved up. And as a result, my reaction getting more intense, right? And that worried thinking. And in that moment, I could see that all I was doing was putting some logs on the fire of worry and insecurity. And I could feel that I was kind of, at this precipice where I could really go there just in this moment. But what came through was like an insightful thought of, I do not want to build my life or my business from worry or insecurity. Like, been there, done that. I have used push and striving and drive and beating myself up, trying to, create. And I didn't want to do that anymore. That was clear. Now, at the time, I had no evidence that this would work, because to me, it looked like my push, my drive, my mental activity, my, pressure was part of my success formula. I was a top executive in this large global company. I'd traveled the world. I got to live abroad. I loved I had such a wonderful life and experience. To me, it was like, isn't it because of that? But again, even though I had no evidence, something inside kept saying, pay attention. Something inside said, do this. And that's all I had. And so over the last 6-7 years, I have evidence now. I have evidence that, oh, wow, I can create and grow my business every year, have more depth and connection and intimacy in my life, have more pleasure and joy. And that the striving, pushing, and driving doesn't have to be there. Now, it still visits me for sure. But I know it's not a necessary ingredient anymore.
That's such a big shift in terms of thinking that, oh, this is an essential ingredient to being successful, to, oh, actually this gets in the way of
Mm.
ultimately experiencing the depth of success. And I know that, from what you've shared, you're seeing that for your own personal life awareness. And is there anything that you'd like to share in terms of what you see in terms of your work with others, where you also notice sort of certain themes that come up, or where people sort of have their aha from going like, oh, it works one way, to actually it works this way?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as you said at the beginning, I think because when I would first came across this understanding, I came across it through Michael Neal, and I hired him to be my coach. And I thought Michael was going to show me how to be smart and strategic. And, I wanted to have someone helping me when I got my business and get my strategies going and everything. And forever grateful to Michael, because he's the one that kind of introduced me to this work. And in my work with him, I can remember, and by the way, he had the patience to like hang out with me initially. So that's why I'm saying this now. But I would constantly come to him, maybe an exaggeration, but I'd be like, yeah, but Michael, what's wrong with wanting what I want? I mean, I just want success. I want to get out there. And of course, there's nothing wrong with wanting to have a great business, a business that funds your life, to have a lifestyle that you enjoy. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I had this sort of warped, crazy idea when I would hear people talk about, oh, look to your innate well-being, follow the feeling, you stop striving, like I'd hear those things, and in my mixed up way, they would sound like settle. Or it would sound like they were telling me to just like be okay with life as it was. And I had some ambition and desires, and I was like, no, I don't want to. Or I would hear them talk, and, like the Elsie's and Dickens and George and Linda and Kathy, all the great teachers you have. And because it was so out of my frame of reference, I had this idea like, well, I'll save all those good feelings for after I do all this. I get my juice now by the ambition and the drive, and so the reason I say that is because I had no clue what I was talking about. It took me a while to hear them all say, no, Barb, we're pointing you to something that if you wake up to that innate nature, if you get more familiar with that inside of you, you have your own relationship, your own language, your own relatability to it, and you understand the role, where your experience is coming from, you're going to be experiencing life in a way you didn't even know was possible. And thank God that that thing in me just kept hanging out, and that all those teachers in their own loving way at different times with me, kept pointing me in that direction. And the reason I say all that, Rohini, is because I have loved seeing the richness of the spiritual formless energy behind all of life, that innate well-being, getting a feel for that and watching what grows when we connect to that, watching the fruit that comes from the soil of us living in that understanding and that grounding. And that fruit, you can plant any tree you want. You want to focus on family, your life, your business, all of it. That's totally fine. That's awesome. And so for me, it was like this huge epiphany around, oh, going there allows me to play in the world of business, play in the world of form, and in the game of it all in a really rich and profound way. All the ideas about looking to the spiritual nature completely. I think, it wasn't until I saw the everyday, ordinary, common nature of that power, that potential of our innate well-being, our resiliency, the way we bounce back, the way we rise to the occasion. The mind is designed to give us ideas. A freer mind allows for more depth and connection and listening and creativity. It's when I started to see all that things took off in a really fun way. And I feel like recently, or kind of maybe even the more I learn, there's even more room to grow, and more potential. So I always feel like this student, of it. But when I started to see that for myself, and it might have been you and I, even in this moment, I'm trying to remember, it might have been you and I on a phone call, but it was like, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to point people who want to be in the world. We're all in the world, right? And I want to point them to that the real game changer isn't your best strategy, isn't your best idea, isn't your best formula, your best behavior. The real game changer is seeing this understanding and seeing that freedom of mind, the power and potential of our minds, seeing that potential resides in your presence in the moment, and like watching how that changes people's lives, not just feeling better, which is great, and feeling fulfilled and connected, and that is awesome, but it also changes what we produce and the fruits of our labor in a really fun way. So once I was like, oh yeah, this is awesome. Then I started working with just entrepreneurs and solopreneurs, people like us who are out there on our own trying to, make a business work, and businesses. And I started what looked like, at first, like, how would you teach business people about the understanding? All of a sudden was like, how can I not teach them about this? And so in over the last 7 years, have been working with all different levels of size companies, businesses, solopreneurs, entrepreneurs of big businesses, inventors. And so what I'll share, just a couple of stories, but recently I was working, I'll tell you a recent story. I'm working with a younger guy who is an executive, just got promoted. And as part of his promotion, they wanted to give him some coaching and support. And one of the areas after spending time with him, that, he was so internally sped up. And it was affecting his quality of listening for sure. And, he just had a misunderstanding about where influence came from. He had so much on his mind about, that he was kind of younger in this big role in this higher position. He had all this thinking about how he came across and needing to prove himself. And then he was managing people that were, 10, 20 years older than him. So he had all this thinking about that. And out of an innocent and sincere desire to want to do well, he was doing some things that were damaging his rapport with people, that were having him come across as uncompromising and egotistical. Like people were kind of saying all these things. But in our conversation, when he started to realize that the quality of his own mind, right, was affecting his ability to be with people in a real way, to really listen, to understand them, and to know when to speak and when to be quiet, which for him was a hard thing prior to this, all of a sudden when he had no visibility to the quality of his mind, right? It wasn't anything he'd ever heard or talked about. When he'd heard about state of mind before, it was about like, get in a state of mind, right? Get in a certain mindset. And when he started to learn this, all of a sudden he he was saying things to me like, he used to, if there were 2 hours in his schedule free, he was thinking about how to fill it up. If he had a meeting that he was going to and it involved his peers or a bunch of people, he was speaking way too often. Like there were just some things he was doing. But over time, and I just had a phone call with him, I think it was yesterday, he was sharing how he said, "You'd be so proud of me." And I said, "Oh, why is that?" And he said, I had a 2-day meeting with a group of people from, across the states. And I contributed, but I only spoke when I felt like what I had to say wasn't being said, when I felt like it would have contribution. He said, I learned something, which, when you're not a good listener or you think you have all the answers, you don't really learn. But he said, I took in and I learned something. And then he said, but most importantly, I had a few hours on my calendar this last week that I didn't fill in. And in that space, he said, I was able to handle some stuff that needed to get handled. And I went home that night and was able to be really present to my wife and my kids. Now it sounds maybe, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but for him, those things were game changers. His ability to walk around not a victim of his own internal quality of mind, but to now see it and be able to leverage it has been really important in his rapport building, his influence, his leadership, and his home life.
That across the board shift is so key in terms of the shift in understanding.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Sorry, did I interrupt you? We're gonna.
No.
So what I was thinking about as you were sharing that is that when you saw, like, how can I not point people in this direction? These are the results that you see, and it's not just in one specific area, but as the fruits that you're talking about, when people's internal understanding rises, the whole game changes for them. And then they're able to see the benefits in every area of their life, whether it's, their sleep, whether there's connection in their relationships, whether it's their fresh ideas that they're getting. So, I mean, that's such a wonderful example of that shift that happens when somebody really sees the value. Because when he was filling up all his time, he didn't see the value of having more spaciousness. And I can certainly relate. I didn't realize there was value in that either.
Yeah. It's funny with the podcast you mentioned, it's been fun because I've been interviewing different entrepreneurs and business leaders that have been impacted by this understanding. And my goal there is to do exactly what you're asking me. Like, no. Well, how has this helped you? Like, really, how has it helped you? Other than feeling good, And James Layfield is one of the interviews, and his story comes to mind right now. Is James is a serial entrepreneur. He worked for Richard Branson at one time. He's owned many successful products and businesses. And he said prior to this understanding that he, on the outside, he checked all the boxes for success. And all of his friends would have said he was a success. But success came at a price and a lot of struggle. And he said, but the truth is, it was, Aaron Turner was the person that worked with James initially and introduced him to this understanding. He said after his time with Aaron and after learning from Aaron, he has been able to achieve greater levels of success, which means financial success, product success, turning over businesses and not having them fail when he steps out. A whole variety of things that on the outside are better. And he's done it with more ease, less pressure, and he works less. And I think that story, there's so many versions. I know the clients you work, you can think of people like that. And that's the thing. That's why it's a, how can I not? How can I not help people? Because we're not asking them to give up any of their heart's desires, their, any of that kind of stuff. We're actually just waking people up to say, hey, you got something going for you. You have everything you need. And that pressure, strive, stress has a major downside, and it's not a necessary ingredient.
Yeah, that really stood out to me when you said that wasn't part of the success formula, because I think that's where people get really confused,
Yeah.
because it really looks like those go together. And there's a real fear, like you said, like, am I just going to sit on the couch and do nothing? But because I think we're so exhausted, we actually
Yeah.
need to do that for a little bit.
Maybe you will, but not forever.
That's right. But to take that out of the equation and really see, like, what is the differentiator?
Mm-hmm.
And what you're pointing to is that it's got nothing to do with that, and everything to do with the freedom of internal mind that we have, and the ability to really listen deeply to the fresh and inspired ideas, and have our behavior be fueled by them rather than the noise of our anxiety and worry, or even, which is one of the things you've said, even those logical ideas.
Yeah.
They don't look like anxiety or feel like it, but they're not the same place. So I'd love for you to say more about that, because that's something I really got from you.
Yeah, that was like one of my, like, if in a way I would say it now is, if you don't think thought, your thought is limiting you in any way, then you are a victim of it at some level. Like, I mean, really, I have just seen this over and over. And for me, it was the reasonable one I didn't see as thought or self-doubt. And I'll just say the kind of impetus of this realization was, I got feedback, and somebody said, you seem to have lost your inspiration. You seem to, kind of not be there. What's going on? It's not like you. And when you hear something, and like, I hadn't even occurred to me, but as soon as someone says it and it's truth, you're like, oh, and I was like, oh, I know you're right. And I don't have a clue. And, we were both working and went on to our separate things. But of course, as soon as we see something, as soon as that initial thing happens, we're covered. Our wisdom, that innate nature, is going to help us out. So over the next couple of days, I started to see, and I realized that I had been having these kind of ideas for my business, but I had been poo-pooing on them, but in a very rational, reasonable way. I'd have an idea and be like, oh yeah, you don't have time for that. Oh, nobody really wants that. Oh, so-and-so's already doing that. Oh, who do you think you are? That maybe was the most charged one, right? But because they weren't coming through me as sort of this majorly charged thing, they were just reasonable. They had a feeling of reasonableness, rationalness, I didn't see them as thought. Made up, arbitrary thought. And when I did, in that moment, I went, oh, it's just self-doubt. It's just another form of a self-doubt thinking. That's all it is. So in a way, I saw I had been raining on my own parade. I had been my own wet blanket, to any kind of inspiration, through just being reasonable about stuff. And that, as soon as I saw that, I immediately felt lighter. It was interesting. It was so amazing. And then all of a sudden I could feel like my energy changing, and started paying attention and noticing. See, once you have a new level of kind of consciousness around something, or something comes to light inside of us, then we kind of carry that with us. So over time, I began to see different ways I would become a wet blanket, through kind of being reasonable and rational. Like, it's still thought, and so what's happened is I started to just follow through on those ideas. I started to just say, okay, let's see what happens. And then through engaging, as you and I have talked so much about in love, but it was really through that it began to say, oh, what happens if I just follow through and take the next step? That hesitating, raining on my blanket, raining on my parade, being a wet blanket, to just taking step it's like, been a complete opportunity for me to step into new potential, capabilities I didn't know I had. And that's what I want to say over and over and over again with every entrepreneur, every parent, every business leader, everyone. At some point, we come up against this idea of a limitation that sometimes feels really real, sometimes just looks true and rational. But if you can start to see and get a feel for the role of thought, that's arbitrary thought, what begins to happen is you naturally start to expand your what's possible for you. And I've seen this with entrepreneurs. Like we were a part of a business accelerator session, and I saw like, oh, someone's arbitrary limit was around pricing. Somebody else's was around scale. Somebody else's was around capability. See this over and over. Just yesterday in my small group mentor program, one of the participants said, I didn't realize that my ideas of who I was, I was capable of, was just made up. And she said, I got invited to this really cool party, but I almost said no, because that thought came through. I don't do those things. That's not me. And she said, but because of what we've been talking about, I knew that was thought. And when I got curious about just letting that idea of what I think is true about me kind of go to the distance, she said, I've gotten really into this party. And it's a costume party and all that kind of stuff. And that's a light example. But you see people in business all the time up against some preconceived idea of who they think they are, or what they're capable of, or what's possible in general. And when they start to have a different relationship to thought, even the reasonable ones, Aaron Turner said to me one time, Barb, if you were, again, the only reason things can feel bold to you is because you're used to being reasonable and rational. But what if it's not really bold? And I think that's true, and kind of giving ourselves permission to move forward in our lives and our businesses and our work and our contribution and our love of people, whatever that is, and dating even, all of that, to begin to move forward from that place is really freeing.
Yeah, it's the ability, like you said, with the reasonable thoughts, like they didn't look like thought. And as soon as we see something as thought, it loses its power over us and tends to look kind of ridiculous once you realize that it's made up and that we don't need it anymore.
Yeah.
And that is such a gift of the depth of what the understanding provides. It's not just about thought, but it's about being able to understand the impact and the implications of thought in our life.
Mm-hmm.
And to see that it's always an ongoing learning curve with it. But the more that we wake up to how we live in this thought created existence and experience, it doesn't change that fact, but our experience within that is so different. Yeah. It's so profoundly different.
Yeah, in a way, what you're saying, Rohini, always makes me think, like, if it's true, we live in this thought-created reality, and we are also a part of this innate, formless, infinite energy, right? So the way we see the world is being shaped by thought in the moment, and knowing that there's a way in which when I get looking and I want to draw a conclusion about me or life or my business or someone else, I kind of know I don't have all the information, right? Because there's always an element of what we don't see in what we're looking at. And knowing that isn't actually a bummer, it's freeing. And it keeps us fluid in our mind, and it keeps us grip and more open to possibility and potential. But also, I just want to say, like, I didn't have any appreciation for the quality of that feeling of this understanding that I could move through life and circumstances do what they're doing, but have this richness and a connection to a knowing of something greater than my circumstance in the moment, to connect to people in a more authentic, real way. I thought that was for the gurus and the special people and I loved people always, right? But I didn't know there was more on offer.
That's lovely. I know we only have a little bit more time left, but I'd love to hear more about your inspiration behind the business summit that you're doing in Portland. I know I've kind of heard a little bit about it, but I haven't really asked you that question. I realized I really want to know more. What's your intent? Where did the idea come from? What's your intention behind it?
Yeah. You know, that you get kind of, when you look back in hindsight, you can see breadcrumbs, like you can see like something that looked like a weird turn all of a sudden makes sense in hindsight. It's a little bit of that when I think about it, because I remember when I moved back to the States in 2012 and had left my job, and I had, learned about the principles the year before. But I had this idea at the time that I wanted to create this global community of kind of business leaders where people were waking up to kind of raising the, awareness, the consciousness of the planet, like waking people up that there was another way. Now, it was an idea that kind of, it had different forms, like I was going to do like a networking group at one point, like it just had different forms. And it was a hint of something, but the time wasn't right, like an idea whose time had not come, And then I, because of my experience working with executive development, I wanted to create a development program based on the principles, but it didn't ever have traction. It didn't have legs. And then I tried to partner with some people around it, and that didn't go anywhere. And so even throughout, I would get these hints and of things I wanted to do, but for whatever reason over those years, it just didn't get traction. And then about a year or so ago, but the love of the business and this understanding has, as you know, I've been able to do that in different ways. But about a year ago, I was in Lake Como, Italy, with some friends, and I just had a moment where all the ideas I had had about a potential global offering for, entrepreneurs and business leaders to kind of wake up to the power and potential of their innate nature as their guiding force versus their drive and their will and the pressure and all of that. Like I relate so much to those people because they're me. I had 30 years of a career before coming across the understanding. So I know what it's like in the corporate world, but I also have had my own business a number of times. So I understand the entrepreneurial world. I've been coaching since 1999. So, it's a world I love and appreciate and relate to. And when I started to see the power of this understanding and doing it in my way with my clients and who are in front of me has been amazing. And I think it's been important training ground for me. I wouldn't change a thing. But last year in Lake Como, I just had this realization, and the words that came through was, the time is now. And I could cry. I don't know why, but sorry, totally unexpected.
No need to apologize.
But, and because of the understanding, because of the teachers, the people behind me, my friends, I knew I could do it. And I knew I to listen to the pace still, to just follow the nudges, to let it be what it's going to be. And the summit and the podcast are kind of two of the ways in which I feel like I'm that vision of being able to support people on a global level and creating a global community, like that's what's so alive for me, is that these summits be a place where people can come, wake up to this understanding, leverage it in their life and in their work, but then also come back year over year. And, you know, we're going to do a European summit, and eventually I would love to do one in Asia Pacific, that these become opportunities for reunion and waking new people up, that they're a chance to create this global community of like-minded people out in the world of business, out creating these lives, these companies that they love, but also doing it from a place of this knowing of who they really are. And so I don't know what October is going to be like. I mean, I have some amazing speakers coming, and these are some of the teachers that have taught me, but I really wanted to showcase, and the majority of the speakers are entrepreneurs and business leaders, and that have been impacted by this understanding, and they're going to share what they've seen, what they've learned for themselves, and in both kind of a really lovely way and real practical ways, how it's helped them be more successful, have more fulfillment in their work, make a bigger difference, have greater impact. So I'm really excited about it. And thanks for asking.
No, you're welcome. And just, you know, it sounds amazing. And the feeling behind it is just so beautiful. And really the vision of helping people to see the relationship between what they're connected to inside of themselves and how that can help them show up in the business world and impact all of those that they work with in a more profound and more successful way. Like, that vision feels huge to me, but it's a great one, and I can absolutely see you doing that. So I'm excited. I didn't realize there was Europe and Asia coming too.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Great. That's wonderful. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to share before we finish up, Barb? Is there anything else you'd like to leave with?
The only thing I just want to say is that this understanding offers an opportunity for people to connect to a truth of who we really are. And the more we see that and we understand the role of thought, we understand the quality of our minds and how that's shaping our moment-to-moment experience, what begins to happen is, I think all of a sudden we're leveraging that all of who we are in a really profound, practical, amazing way for our lives. And when you hear stories about people kind of tapping into things they didn't know they were capable of, or experiencing more depth and intimacy in their relationships, or stepping into new challenges and getting in over their head and not, you know, getting completely destabilized for it. All of those things in and of themselves are really lovely. But I think the real opportunity here is that if all of us begin to understand what we already have going for us, and that we already have built in everything we need, it allows us to take so much off our minds. And in that place, we just kind of naturally connect and love and are inspired and are creative, amazing beings. So that's it.
Well, those are very beautiful words to leave us with. So thank you, Barb, for spending the time with me today. And I know everybody that watches this is going to really enjoy hearing you share what the impact has been on you personally, and also what you see as possible for people, and being able to really connect the understanding with how that has benefit for being in the game of life. Like, that's something that you do so well, and it is so practical, and absolutely I see the results in my life and my clients' life day to day, but it's not an easy thing to express, and you express it really beautifully. So thank
Oh,
you.
thank you, Rohini. It's been awesome as usual. Love being in any conversation with you. So thank you.
Thank
And
you.
I just want to say again, you are an example of what we're talking about. I know that this idea really came from an inspiration and has been a new things. You've had to face new things you've never had to deal with before. You've had to try things. You had to get out of your comfort zone. And I say all that just to say that this class, this webinar, this offering is an example of a real result coming from you learning to listen more to that deeper thing inside of you versus the naysayer or the rational, reasonable thinking as well. So
That's absolutely right. And it is amazing how there's a level of ease that comes with that. And what I notice now is when I come up against something that's not that, I just see, oh, that's just feedback, don't keep banging my head. I used to keep banging my head against that wall.
yeah,
Like, no, that's feedback to look somewhere else. And it is incredible how much easier it is to be productive in the world. Like for me, I feel like I spend much less effort and I get 10 times more done, like literally 10 times, because I was so anxious before. I could barely do anything. Like I was overwhelmed at the drop of a hat. So it's amazing how much more I can play the game of life, be in it, be in the productivity of that from a good feeling place. And what gets done when I'm not constantly buying into all of my self-critical thinking. Like that was a full-time job dealing with that before.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you've been a big part of that. So thank you.
Wow. My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to end the recording now. It's hard to say goodbye.
I
I'll
know.
stop the
Bye, everyone.
recording.